The city of Rome rested under the soft veil of dawn, the sky painted with streaks of muted orange and pale lavender. Long before the clamor of the day began, the great Colosseum stood silently in its place, casting a majestic and haunting shadow over the still streets. To others, it was the place where hope and fear met, where strength could not always save, and where the battles were not always fair. In underground chambers lit only by flickering torches, where the scent of sweat and damp stone lingered, the gladiators woke to another day. It was here that the unbalanced fights took shape, where the brutality of the Roman arena disguised itself in layers of performance. Here, men were made into warriors not by choice, but by necessity. The instructor, known as the Lannister, was a hard man named Gaius. He had never held a blade before the day he was branded as property. He came from the ports of Greece, sold by his uncle to settle a debt. He often looked to Lucius for guidance, not in words, but in the way he stood near him, mirrored his movements, and followed his pace during drills. He had the eyes of one who had seen too much blood, but chose never to speak of it. There was little ceremony. The sand was uneven, and the seats were filled with rougher men, ones who shouted without care for protocol. Crassus raised his blade, but the Lannister signaled the end. Lucius was dragged away, sore and bruised, but breathing. This time, he was not facing a soldier. He was to fight a beast, a lion imported from Numidia, starved and kept in a dark cage, stirred only by the smell of flesh. In the cell that night, Darius asked him how he had known when to fall. The emperor was not present, but senators and nobles had come, dressed in white and gold. Musicians played before the match. Vendors walked the aisles with trays of figs and olives, and the sun hung high in the sky like a silent watcher. Lucius smiled faintly and replied that knowing when not to fight was sometimes the only way to keep fighting. Lucius knew it would not be killed unless he forced the blow. He hesitated, looked at the edge of the arena where the handlers waited with javelins. He raised the spear, then lowered it. He stepped back and dropped the weapon. He was given a spear and a net, tools meant to mimic the style of Ariciarius, though he had never trained with either. He looked around at the walls that rose like cliffs, filled with faces, all watching, some curious, some cruel, one armed with a trident, the other with a sword. He did not win, but he did not fall. The crowd saw his courage. They cheered when he survived. Darius had only a dagger and a small round shield. It was not fair. It was never meant to be. The match was meant to prove the strength of the ludus, not the fairness of the fight. It looked not for glory, but for food. But the sand always remembered the steps of those who walked it not for glory, but for peace. He barked orders and tested every limb for power, every spirit for weakness. It reflected the hunger of the empire, the need to see others struggle, so that one could feel powerful. They were not champions, but they were men who lived each moment with purpose. The story of the Unbalanced Fights was not only about violence, it was about survival, about finding stillness in chaos, and about the quiet power of choosing to endure. In an empire that demanded spectacle, they offered quiet defiance. But it also revealed something else, a glimmer of resistance in those who chose not to play by the script, who fought with dignity, even when the rules were tilted. Then at Crassus wore the armor of a Mirmillo, heavy and gleaming, with a tall crest of horsehair and a large rectangular shield. Lucius moved again, this time using the spear to drive the beast away, but he did not strike. He circled, baiting it, tiring it. Minutes passed like hours. Some booed, some stood, some demanded blood. But the Lannister raised his hand again. The fight was over. Lucius was spared. So was the lion. Lucius dodged, pivoting lightly on bare feet, his heart calm despite the odds. He knew this was not a battle to win, but a performance to survive. Lucius was given only a simple wooden sword and a light tunic. It was not a test of skill. It was a display. Darius watched him carefully, then whispered that he had seen something change in the faces of the crowd. Not all had wanted death. Some had watched with something like awe and ritual, yet remained as raw and as cruel as the sharp edges of a gladius blade. It was an enormous oval of stone and mortar, ringed by arches and worn down by time. Lucius rolled with the force, falling but rising again, dodging the edge of the blade that shimmered in the light. The crowd jeered, cried for blood, but Lucius did not give it. He yielded at the right moment, feigned injury where he could, and allowed himself to be thrown down before the real damage was done. But in those years of its prime, it was alive, roaring, breathing with the energy of thousands. a tall man with sun-darkened skin and shoulders built by years of labor, not war. He had not been born into combat. He had not asked to fight. He had once tended olive trees on a quiet hill in a village far from the marble city. But his land had been taken, his rights stripped, and he was sold as punishment for a defiance. Belly whispered. He did not curse fate. He simply learned to survive, to breathe slow, and to listen. To many, it was the heart of the empire. But long before the crowds filled the wooden benches and nobles took their places in the shaded seating, the story of every match began in silence. Lucius was among them. The Ludusor training school was both prison and temple. Lucius trained alongside others who had been pulled from every corner of the empire. Some were captured soldiers, some were criminals, some were slaves purchased purely for their potential, and a few had come willingly, chasing glory or coin. They all wore the same tunic, bore the same marks, and lived under the same sky, but they carried different wounds inside. Among them was a boy no older than 17, lean and quick, named Darius. Their first fight was not in the Colosseum, but in a smaller arena near the outskirts of the city, a place where new gladiators were tested in front of smaller crowds. Lucius was paired against a seasoned fighter named Crassus, who had once served as a centurion. As the horn blew, Lucius stepped forward with steady breath, circling slowly, not rushing. Crassus charged, the shield raised like a wall. Blows came fast. The shield struck like a battering ram. He was spared not because of mercy, but because the crowd saw enough. Darius listened, and the lesson rooted itself in his mind. Weeks passed, and the games grew larger. The day came when the name of Lucius appeared on the slate for the Colosseum itself. The Colosseum was alive that day. Every seat was taken. Lucius was led to the center of the arena, alone. The gate creaked open. The lion stepped out, its golden mane rippling, its ribs showing slightly through its sides. Lucius held the net loosely, the spear angled downward. He did not move. The lion paced. The crowd hushed. He sidestepped, barely, and the net whipped through the air. It missed. The lion turned sharply, claws scraping the sand. Eventually, the lion slowed, panting. The crowd erupted. That night, Lucius sat in the cell once more, silent. Lucius did not speak. He simply rested his back against the stone and closed his eyes. The next day, Darius was called to fight. His opponent was not a man, but two. But Darius remembered what Lucius had said. He moved with purpose. He used the terrain. He kept his breath steady, and so it continued. Day by day, match by match. The Colosseum was more than a place of death. It was a mirror. Lucius and Darius were not heroes, and as the years passed and more matches came, their names faded from the ledgers, but not from the whispers of the Ludus. The Colosseum still stood. As time moved on, as empires rose and fell, the wind over the rooftops of Rome shifted gently, brushing the ancient tiles with quiet grace. The light of the morning sun spilled slowly across the forum, where statues cast long, noble shadows across the stone pavements. But the true heart of the city beat beneath the sands of the Colosseum, where stories far greater than battles had begun to take shape. His muscles ached with familiar dullness, a reminder not of weakness, but of the body's commitment to endure. His hands, once calloused from tending olives, were now scarred from the grip of swords and the recoil of strikes. In the Ludus Magnus, the grandest of the gladiator schools, situated near the great amphitheater, the rhythm of life was firm but silent. Training began before sunrise and ended as the stars returned. There was no music, no conversation beyond what was necessary. Meals were taken in silence. Sleep earned an exhausted collapse. But in this silence, bonds formed without words. He believed in discipline, not brutality. His rule was ironbound, his punishment swift, but he did not starve his men, nor did he waste them. He respected skill, but he understood something deeper, that survival was the truest strength. He dreamed only of stillness. The older gladiator had gained the crowd's attention not through violence, but through restraint that made him dangerous, not to his opponents, but to the illusion the Colosseum tried to maintain, that this was glory, that this was justice, that the arena was where men proved their worth. A senator had spoken of a match where a lion had been spared, where the crowd had cheered a man who had refused to kill, a recreation of a mythical battle, one of Rome's own legends, where a single gladiator would face a carefully staged ambush of enemies disguised as barbarians. not for his favor, but for his silence. They thought he would not question. It was to be a dramatic performance, complete with painted shields and torches, meant to stir pride in the Empire's might. Some were intrigued, others were unsettled. The games were meant to be bloody, not merciful. He often whistled under his breath during sparring, a faint tune that reminded him of waves. That evening, he sat beneath the narrow opening in the roof of the barracks, where a small square of sky was visible. There was a Mer taken from the deserts of the east, who moved like wind and rarely missed a strike. And there was Anara, one of the rare female gladiators trained in secret, who had survived 3 matches under a mask to hide her identity. He was to play the part of a Roman champion, a lone hero holding the frontier. They were not true enemies. They were gladiators too, chosen for their size and presence. There was grace in his rhythm now, and a spark of something unspoken. Lucius had watched it develop slowly, like the rise of the sun, steady, inevitable. The first attacker charged, swinging wide. Lucius blocked and countered with a spin, sending the man to the ground. Cheers erupted. Wooden weapons clacked against shields. Bare feet scuffed the sand, and the quiet breathing of men focused on their drills echoed through the stone halls. Lucius feinted, stepped aside, disarmed one, and kicked the other away. Together, they turned to the Emperor's box and bowed. Trumpeters played heroic themes as the gates opened. The crowd leaned forward, eyes hungry, not for blood, but for drama. Lucius rose that morning with the same calm breath he always carried. It was not outrage, not all, but enough. It was surprise. Lucius disarmed him with a twist, but did not strike. Instead, he turned to the crowd and raised his blade, not in triumph, but in pause. He no longer dreamed of home. Darius, younger, but no longer unsure, trained nearby. His movements had grown faster, smoother. The days at the Ludus were long. There was Septimus, a former sailor from the coast of Hispania, broad and cheerful even in his quiet. They were not a unit, not comrades in war, but they were survivors. That was enough. The Lanista, Gaius Varenus, was not a cruel man by nature, but by function. He watched Lucius closely these days. The truth was quieter. Darius slept soundly, his face peaceful. Lucius remained awake, listening to the wind as it moved through the small square of sky. The Emperor had heard whispers of Lucius. Still, the Emperor was curious. He ordered a new event to be arranged, a test of spectacle. Lucius was chosen as the lead. When he heard the plan, he said nothing. He simply nodded and returned to training. Darius joined him quietly. "They want to see a legend," Lucius said. "They always do," Darius replied. "They forget that legends are built from lies." Darius looked up at the sky with him. Stars had begun to appear, scattered like grains of salt across a black cloth. "Then make it your truth," Darius said softly. Lucius said nothing, but a faint warmth stirred in his chest. The day of the performance came. The arena was prepared with elaborate scenery, painted trees, wooden hills, false rocks to mimic a wild landscape. Lucius was given a polished sword, light armor, and a red cape. From the opposite side of the arena, 5 men entered dressed as barbarian warriors, their faces painted blue and green, their hair matted, their weapons blunt but real enough. The match began with thunderous applause. Lucius moved slowly, letting the performance flow. The second and third approached together. The fourth fought harder. Their blades met with loud clangs, sparks flying. He looked up, eyes steady, and then lowered his sword. He stepped back. The fifth opponent stood uncertain. Lucius walked to him, offered the hilt of his weapon, and nodded. The man hesitated, then took it. A silence swept the arena. The moment held. Then, unexpectedly, a noble woman stood and clapped. Slowly, others followed. Lucius left the arena that day, not as a victor, but as a message. Later, in the shadows of the barracks, the Lanista found him. "You risked much," Gaius Varenus said. Lucius nodded. "You may not be called again, or you may be called more than ever." Lucius said nothing. He knew both were true. That night, a cool breeze moved through the halls of the Ludus. The stars were quiet. The city was quieter. And somewhere in the vast heart of Rome, the Colosseum rested once more. But the sand remembered. It always remembered. The dawn light filtered through narrow slits in the high stone walls of the Ludus, painting slender bars of gold across the sand-covered floor. Lucius moved among his fellow gladiators, like a shadow at sunrise, silent and measured. Each breath he took seemed to draw energy from the earth itself. grounding him in the steady rhythm of survival. Today, the air carried a hint of change. Whispers had passed through the corridors like a gentle breeze. The Emperor's interest in Lucius had spread, drawing attention from the highest chambers of power. Some thought it a blessing, others a quiet threat. Lucius did not think about either. He simply trained. Darius found him near the practice pit, standing before the crude wooden dummies marred with the gouges of countless sword strikes. The boy's eyes were bright with questions he dared not voice. "Are you ready for what comes next?" Darius asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Lucius paused, running a hand across the shaft of his wooden sword. "The arena always changes," he replied. "We must change with it." They began their drills, stepping through footwork and parries. Each motion was deliberate, each strike precise. "But be mindful, what you say will ripple farther than this school." Torches flickered along the walls, casting shifting patterns of light and dark. He offered a small nod, and Lucius returned it. No questions were asked. He tucked it beneath his tunic and left without another word. He gestured to a parchment sealed with the Emperor's signature. The water was still, reflecting the torchlight like liquid glass. He stripped away his armor and dipped his hands in the cool depth. The scales of sweat and dust washed away, leaving only the faintest sheen of blood from old wounds. A chance to address the people from the podium of the arena. "Before your next match." Anara moved between them, correcting a thrust here, a guard there, her eyes sharp despite her quiet demeanor. Not the nobles in their silken garments, nor the senators in togas of white and purple. He thought of the families in the stands, the merchants in the aisles, the children clutching small figurines of gladiators, those whose lives were untouched by the arena's cruelty. He wrapped himself in a towel, each step echoing in the vaulted chamber. He found Darius waiting outside. Even in the brutal world they inhabited, there were moments of calm instruction, messages of trust passed without words. "But know this, the arena does not reveal the might of our empire. It reveals our own hearts. When we cheer a lopsided fight, when we demand cruelty, we show the weakness we seek to deny." No blade was drawn, no lion was released. The message stood on its own. True strength lies in mercy. True glory lies in compassion. Remember that when the torchlight fades and only shadows remain. In this sanctuary of repetition, the body forgot fear and learned only purpose. Across the yard, Septimus was sparring with Amma, their blades ringing like distant bells. Mid-morning, the Lannister summoned Lucius alone. The corridor leading to Gaius Varenus' office was cool and echoing. There was no need. In every silent gaze, in every measured breath, they understood its weight. Inside, Varenus stood by a table strewn with scrolls and tokens. The roar of the crowd crashed over him like waves. He paused at the center, the sand cool beneath his feet. "You have been granted what few receive," he said, voice low. By the time the gates opened, the mist had lifted, revealing the full scale of the audience. Tens of thousands gathered in anticipation. Lucius's heart did not race, but his mind flickered. Public speech was not his domain. His strength was calm, his words simple. "You will speak of what you choose," Varenus continued. Lucius nodded. He felt the weight of the scroll in his hand, not as authority, but as responsibility. Back in the yard, Darius sensed something had shifted. That evening, Lucius sat by the small pool in the bathing chambers. He thought of the people who would gather in the Colosseum. What would they need to hear? What stories would bring them closer to the truth beneath the spectacle? When he rose from the water, he felt the air cooler on his skin. "They gave me the scroll," Lucius said simply. Darius's eyes widened. "Tomorrow." Then, "Tomorrow," Lucius confirmed. The next dawn arrived, soft and quiet. A thin mist hovered above the Colosseum's outer walls, blurring the stones into silvery haze. Lucius entered the arena alone, clad in his light tunic and carrying no weapons. He raised a hand, calling for silence. It fell swiftly, the masses leaning in, curiosity burning in their eyes. He spoke in a voice clear and even. "People of Rome, you come here for marvels of strength. You come for battles that test limits." He let his words settle, watching faces soften, children turning to their mothers, merchants lowering their wares, nobles leaning forward, no longer with pride, but with thought. Then he turned and walked away, leaving only the imprint of his footsteps in the sand. Back in the Ludus that night, no one spoke of the speech, and as Lucius closed his eyes to sleep, he felt the first stirrings of something new, an ember of hope glowing quietly. promising that even in unbalanced fights, the human spirit could find its balance. In the days following Lucius's speech, the ludus held its breath. No command came from the emperor, no messengers arrived with punishment, nor was any favor shown. Yet within the arena, within the city, and within the hearts of those who had heard his words, something subtle had begun to stir. He did not seek to provoke or inspire. He sought only to live with dignity in a place built to strip it away. The speech was spoken of in murmurs, never loudly, never boldly, but it traveled. A servant whispered of it to a merchant's wife. This was the Saturnalia series, a celebration of the winter solstice. During Saturnalia, roles reverse slaves could speak freely. Masters gave gifts, and the city embraced chaos with strange joy. He was in the outer yard, wrapping linen around his forearms, when Phoenix passed, followed by his own trainer. Their eyes met briefly. It was during this time that the most unusual and unexpected matches were often arranged. Darius sat with Lucius near the torchlight, polishing the edge of a training blade. A retired soldier mentioned it in a tavern. A scribe recorded the words in the margin of a private journal. In Rome, such ripples could become rivers. Lucius returned to his training, as he always had, as he always would. But the world around him was moving, even if he did not see it. Two fighters, nearly equal in skill and size, dressed identically, wielding the same weapons, would face each other without an announced champion. His name was Phoenix. He had no titles, no victories carved in marble, but his record was spoken of with quiet respect. The crowd was large, though not wild. There was an energy of expectation, but not of violence. Phoenix was not brutal. He was deliberate. He ended fights quickly, without flourish, and with a sense of purpose. Few understood. Both carried gladi, short and sharp, and small round shields. The idea was to remove bias. The crowd would choose whom to support, not based on names, but by watching. The sand stirred beneath them like dust in a silent storm. The next series of games was already being planned. This time, it would not be a show for curiosity or myth. One of those matches would be Lucius's next. It was called a mirror fight, a concept rarely used. It was ended by signal. The lanista raised his hand, and the crowd, confused but respectful, erupted not in fury, but in applause. Lucius was to face a gladiator brought in from a distant ludus in Capua. The crowd leaned forward, not cheering, not jeering, but watching, truly watching. Lucius saw him for the first time 2 days before the match. Lucius's foot caught uneven ground, and Phoenix stepped forward, gladius raised. But instead of delivering the strike, he paused. He saw Lucius raise his blade in time, saw the fire still in his eyes, and he stepped back. There was no threat in that look, no challenge, only the calm recognition of two men who understood the game. The winds of winter swept across the rooftops, carrying with them the sounds of the city merchants calling, bells ringing, laughter rising from Saturnalia feasts. That night, the barracks were quieter than usual. "He fights like you," Darius said. Lucius nodded. A condemned prisoner, known only by his was to face 3 trained gladiators in what the scrolls called a punitive contest. "Will you hold back?" Lucius looked toward the shadows near the sleeping quarters. "Only if it serves life." He had once served as a legionary, but had turned against his commander during a campaign in Gaul. The man sat alone, staring through the iron bars of the torchlight on the wall. The records said he refused an order. He saved villages. He disobeyed Rome. Now, he would pay. The morning of the mirror fight arrived with clear skies and cool air. Lucius dressed in simple leather and iron. So did When they entered the arena, the crowd hushed. The two men stood, 20 paces apart, mirroring each other in stance and breath. Then the horns sounded. They moved, not with fury, but with care. Every strike was met with a block. Every step was matched. They fought for minutes that stretched into something timeless. They did not speak. They did not taunt. Eventually, the rhythm shifted. Lucius exhaled slowly. He nodded. Only the third, a younger man from another ludus, rushed forward. The match was not decided by blood. Lucius blocked the third gladiator's blade. Just once, just enough to turn it aside. It was noticed. 2 men had fought as equals, and both had walked away. He was taken back in chains, but his story had reached thousands. That evening, Phoenix sat beside Lucius by the well near the corner of the ludus yard. They did not speak for a long time. Then Phoenix said, "They expect beasts. We gave them balance." It was not defiance. It was restraint, Lucius replied, and they did not reject it. Phoenix stood, clapped Lucius gently on the shoulder, and returned to his quarters. The air was still, and beneath that stillness, the Colosseum exhaled. Not all gladiators were meant to be rivals. The days passed gently. For a moment, life outside the walls of the Ludus seemed less distant, but peace within the Colosseum was always temporary. A new match was announced. This time, it would not be a test of equals. It would be a test of survival. Lucius was named one of the three. He asked no questions. The man they would face arrived in chains. He was tall, strong, scarred deeply across his cheek. The night before the match, Lucius found him in the holding pen. "You do not look afraid," Lucius said. "I've already lost everything," the man replied. "Fear is behind me." Lucius sat across from him. "You saved people," Lucius said. "I did," the man answered, "and I'd do it again." Lucius nodded. In the silence, a bond formed. The next day, they entered the arena. The crowd was larger than usual. Punitive contests were bloody affairs. The people came expecting rage, but what they saw was different. Lucius did not charge. He walked forward slowly, raising his blade but not striking. The second gladiator, Septimus, followed his lead. The rebel fought hard, not to kill, but to survive. His strikes were clean, defensive. The crowd began to murmur. The young gladiator struck again, this time harder, but Lucius stood between them. Septimus joined him. It was not a rebellion. The match was stopped. The rebel was wounded, but alive. Later that night, Darius found Lucius in the corridor. He stepped between the blade. He said quietly, "Yes," Lucius replied. "Why?" Lucius looked toward the barred window above them, where the sky was beginning to clear. "Because someone must," he said. The stars above Rome were quiet again. The sand remembered. It always would. The morning light rose pale and soft over Rome, touching the stone walls of the Ludus with tender warmth. Within those walls, the rhythm of life had settled into a gentle pattern of training, rest, and quiet reflection. Lucius moved through the barracks with measured steps, each breath a reminder of the steady calm he sought to maintain. He found Darius at the practice pit, tracing circles in the sand with the tip of a wooden sword. The boy looked up as Lucius approached, eyes bright yet steady. Two pairs of gladiators would fight behind a veiled screen, the crowd only able to judge purely on form and flow, not on identity or reputation. It was an experiment in perception, a test of whether true skill could transcend the spectacle. Their weapons danced through the air in mirrored patterns, each movement a conversation without words. He followed her lead, she followed his. In that quiet space, trust blossomed. "Another match approaches," Darius said softly. Lucius nodded. "And another choice." Faces turned to see Lucius and Inara standing unbowed, while their opponents knelt in exhaustion. The air was cool, scented with jasmine from a nearby garden. A roar of applause rose, not for violence, but for artistry. Their next contest was announced as a shadow bout. On the other side of the screen stood a newcomer stall formidable, with reputations as fierce combatants. Word of the shadow bout spread through the city. People spoke of it with reverence, as though art had stepped into the arena. Another noble had argued that the Colosseum's purpose was blood and spectacle, not compassion and art. Lucius was paired with the masked female fighter whose grace and precision were whispered about but rarely witnessed. In the hours before the match, Lucius and Inara trained together in silence. The crowd's murmur rose and fell like waves. The screen was lit from above, casting their shadows onto the canvas as they faced their opponents. The procession would wind through the streets, showcasing the Empire's mighty legions in full armor, banners unfurled, exotic beasts in gilded cages. At its heart would be the next contest, Lucius against a champion of the North, a behemoth known for crushing foes beneath his great axe. They forget that power is hollow without meaning. He continued his routine, sparring at dawn, meals in silence, meditation by the small pool. Lucius and Inara flowed around them, redirecting energy like water steering around stone. The crowd fell silent, entranced by the dance. Lucius stepped forward alone. The champion followed. The crowd roared in expectation. He knelt, placing the weapon upright before him. A ripple of shock passed through the crowd, then a swell of applause. Lucius stood in the shadow of the Colosseum wall, clad in simple gear, while the champion of the North, tall Lucius, held his ground, breathing even. The axe came down with earth-shaking force, but Lucius sidestepped, the blade grazing empty air. Lucius lifted his voice, calm but strong. The might you bear, the strength you show, can be wielded to protect, not just to destroy. He extended a hand, then dropped it, and fearsome marched in with his axe resting on his shoulder. When the time came, they entered the arena behind the great white curtain. He ran his hand along the smooth marble, remembered the faces that had watched him, some angry, some inspired, all changed. He thought of the choice he would have to make, to fight as expected, or to bend the spectacle into something new once more. The shadows moved with fluid grace. Lucius felt Anera's presence beside him, guiding his stance, matching his strikes. They advanced as one, retreating as one, a single silhouette of purpose. The horn sounded, blades clashed in the darkness. Their opponents pressed hard, but could not find center. Finally, with a signal from the Lanista, the screen was dropped, and the sands of the Colosseum, cooled by frost and memory, waited for dawn's light, ready to welcome the next story etched into their grain. That night, Lucius and Anara shared a rare meal of roasted figs and goat cheese in the small courtyard. "You were light as air," Anara said, smiling beneath her mask. "And you were fire in water," Lucius replied. They ate in companionable silence, each savoring the taste of victory not won by blood, but by balance. The following days passed smoothly. The Ludus seemed to hum with a quiet pride. But even calm water can conceal currents. A rumor reached the barracks. A senator had petitioned the emperor to end Lucius's unconventional declaring them disrespectful to tradition. Lucius heard the whispers but did not speak of them. Then came the announcement. A grand procession would precede an extraordinary match. The night before, Lucius wandered the empty corridors of the Colosseum itself. Darius found him near the emperor's box, now empty beneath the moonlight. "They prepare a parade of power," Darius observed. Lucius exhaled slowly. Darius nodded. "Then give them meaning." The morning of the procession was crisp and clear. Rome poured into the streets to watch the display. The parade ended at the arena gates. When the horn sounded, the champion raised his axe high and charged. The champion stopped. He looked around, puzzled. A hush fell. The champion hesitated, then lowered his axe. That evening, as winter's first frost touched the stones, Lucius and Darius stood at the edge of the Ludus courtyard. "You changed his heart," Darius said softly. Lucius watched the stars above. "Perhaps he changed mine." In the quiet that followed, beyond the walls, the city rested under the cloak of night. The days following the northern champion's surrender were filled with a curious calm. Rome seemed to breathe easier, as if the arena's unexpected mercy had softened even the city's ancient stones. The Colosseum stood sentinel, its arches catching the fading sunlight, a silent witness to stories both brutal and beautiful. Lucius continued his routine, waking before dawn to the quiet hum of the Ludus, moving through the familiar patterns of training with a steady heart. The seasons shifted him, leaves turned from green to gold, and the scent of autumn settled over the city like a gentle cloak. News of Lucius's matches had spread beyond the walls. "You will face an opponent chosen not by chance or design, but by fate itself, a former gladiator, returned from exile, hungry for redemption." Gaius Varenus awaited him with a scroll in hand and a grave expression. Now, he had been recalled, his freedom conditional on victory. Merchants spoke of him in the forums. Mothers whispered his name to their children, and even some senators began to reconsider the spectacle they had long demanded. The empire's appetite for cruelty was, perhaps, not as insatiable as once thought. Yet, for all the quiet hope, shadows lingered. One evening, as twilight draped the city in hues of purple and blue, Lucius was summoned to the Lanista's chambers. "The emperor has decreed your next match will be unlike any before," Varenus said, voice low. Each pushed the other to limits, both physical and mental, testing the strength that years had carved into their forms. Lucius nodded slowly. He had heard whispers of this man Marcus Valens once, a celebrated fighter who had fallen from favor, cast out for defying an order during a grand spectacle. He was a man carved from the harsh edges of life, his body marked by scars both old and new. Lucius found Marcus seated alone beneath a twisted olive tree, fingers tracing patterns in the earth, and a light trying to pierce it. His eyes burned with a fierce fire, tempered by the wisdom of hard lessons. The weight of this news settled on Lucius like a stone. heavy but steady. Their eyes met briefly, a silent vow passing between them. Days later, Marcus arrived at the Ludus. Lucius met him in the training yard, the air crisp with the promise of winter's approach. Senators, soldiers, citizens all gathered to witness the clash of two men shaped by fate and choice. The fight was fierce but measured, a ballet of power and precision. "Your reputation precedes you," Marcus said, extending a hand. Lucius clasped it firmly. "And yours, though tempered by exile." They circled each other in silent greeting, two warriors bound by shared history and uncertain futures. Training together was a careful dance of respect and challenge. The days unfolded slowly, the horizon marked by the distant glow of Rome's fires. On the eve of their match, the Ludus was unusually quiet. "You carry your past like a shadow," Lucius said softly. Marcus looked up, eyes reflecting the stars. Lucius smiled faintly. "Perhaps together we can find balance." The morning of the match dawned clear and cold. The Colosseum was packed beyond capacity, the air thick with anticipation. Lucius and Marcus entered the arena amid thunderous applause. The horn sounded. Blades met with resonant clangs. Shields rose and fell like waves. Neither sought to kill, both sought to understand. As minutes stretched, sweat glistened on skin. Breaths came heavy, but controlled. At last, Marcus faltered, a quick step backward, and Lucius lowered his blade. The lanista raised a hand, signaling the end. The crowd erupted not with calls for blood, but with cheers for honor. Later, as night wrapped the city in velvet, Lucius and Marcus stood on the Colosseum's upper tier, gazing out over Rome's lights. "Exile changes a man," Marcus said, "and survival changes him again," Lucius replied. They shared a quiet moment, the noise of the city fading beneath the stars. In the heart of Rome, where shadows and light danced eternally, two gladiators had rewritten the story of strength, and the sands remembered. They always remembered. The chill of early winter lingered in the air as dawn crept softly across the rooftops of Rome. The city awoke beneath a sky brushed with pale hues, the ancient stones glowing faintly in the morning light. The Colosseum loomed silently, a vast amphitheater holding centuries of stories, each grain of sand a testament to the passage of time. Within the stone walls of the Ludus's life moved with its familiar rhythm. Lucius rose quietly, his breath steady, muscles warm from years of discipline. The emperor's eyes were watching. Today was not just another day of training. It was the beginning of a new chapter in the unfolding story written in the heart of the arena. The Ludus was alive with activity. New gladiators arrived, each carrying their own stories of loss and hope. Among them was a young woman named Livia, fierce and determined, who had been rescued from the outskirts of the city and trained to fight in secret. He carried his gladius and shield, but more than that, he carried the quiet hope of those who sought meaning beyond the fight. The crowd roared as they faced each other, weapons raised. Lucius moved with calm precision, parrying and stepping aside, reading Titus's every move. Titus fought with passion, his strikes fierce, but Lucius matched them with measured grace. Titus hesitated, then grasped it, the crowd erupting in applause. Her presence stirred something unspoken within the barracks. The world outside was vast, uncertain, but within the walls of the Ludus, a new strength was growing. The emperor had decreed a series of matches to celebrate the coming spring, each designed to showcase the empire's strength, unity, and tradition. Lucius was to participate, but not merely as a fighter. He was to be an example, a symbol of resilience and honor. Darius approached him with a gentle smile. "The emperor's message has arrived," he said, handing Lucius a sealed scroll. Lucius broke the wax seal with calm fingers. The message was brief, yet heavy with implication. The announcement carried subtle warnings. However, the games were to be grander than ever, and the rules stricter. Over the following days, Lucius trained with renewed focus. Lucius took time to teach her, guiding her through the motions with patience. Their connection was silent but strong, a shared understanding between those who had learned to survive in a world that demanded strength without mercy. The spring festival approached. The streets of Rome were decorated with garlands and banners, the air filled with the scent of blooming flowers and roasting meats. The Colosseum stood ready to welcome the crowds once more. On the day of his match, Lucius donned armor, polished to a soft sheen, the weight familiar but not burdensome. His opponent was a gladiator known as Titus, famed for his ferocity and unyielding spirit. The fight began with a clash of steel, sparks flying as blades met. Minutes passed, like moments suspended in time. Neither sought to dominate, but both sought to honor the tradition while challenging its cruelty. At the climax, Lucius disarmed Titus gently, lowering his blade and extending a hand. Later, as the sun dipped low and the city's lights flickered on, Lucius and Livia stood together by the "We fight not just for survival," Lucius said softly, "but for something greater." Livia nodded, her eyes bright with resolve. And as night embraced Rome, the Colosseum rested beneath the stars, its sands forever marked by those who dared to change the story. The sands remembered. They always remembered. Spring unfurled across Rome like a whispered promise, the soft scent of blossoms drifting through the open corridors of the ludus. Warm winds carried dust and stories from the outer, settling into the cracks of the stone, into the folds of tunics, and into the minds of the gladiators who waited, trained, and remembered. He rose, stretched slowly, and stepped into the growing sunlight. Whispers had grown louder, rumors of reform, of change being seeded in the unlikeliest of places, and at the center of it all, unknowingly or not, stood Lucius. The world was shifting. Something about the air felt different, as if Rome itself was holding its breath. Lucius awoke to the sound of steel brushing against leather, the familiar rhythm of early drills echoing from the courtyard. The arena had always been a stage for conflict and blood, but now it bore witness to something more subtle. Philosophers visited the ludus, observing his matches, not for the thrill, but for the meaning behind the movement. A few poets even composed quiet verses, likening him to the stoic warriors of old, shaped by pain but not consumed by it. Then you speak only of the future. In recent weeks, he had begun to draw attention from more than the usual crowd of nobles and gamblers. The newer recruits asked more questions. They spoke of hope as something tangible, not distant. This time, Lucius was to fight in a demonstration of the empire's unity, staged not as a contest, but as a display. The emperor himself would attend, alongside visiting envoys from distant lands. Though many doubted her at first, her skill and quiet focus silenced all but the most arrogant. Lucius watched her carefully, offering corrections when asked, but allowing her to find her own rhythm. Lucius accepted none of it. He still trained with the same discipline, still spoke only when needed, but he noticed the change in those around him. Sand was swept into pristine patterns, and a carved platform was raised for the emperor's viewing pleasure. Among them, Livia continued to rise. She moved with grace and clarity, her blade singing through the air like a hawk on the wind. Together, they moved through a carefully choreographed series of maneuvers, showing the harmony between power and restraint. One afternoon, after hours of sparring beneath the sun, Livia approached him near the olive grove. "You never speak of your past," she said, voice low and steady. Lucius was summoned for a private audience. "Perhaps, in time, Rome will listen to men like you, but as something quieter, a vessel of endurance, a symbol of a new path, because it no longer holds power over me." Lucius looked toward the horizon. She nodded, understanding in her gaze. "I speak only of the present," he said, "because it's the only place we can still act. And yet, you change the hearts of those who watch. Tell me, what do you seek?" Their conversation ended as naturally as it began, silence settling around them like a soft cloak. Not glory, not freedom, just peace for those who have never known it. Days later, another match was declared. Lucius prepared not for bloodshed, but for performance. The challenge was to embody the strength and control of a gladiator, while honoring the traditions of peace. The arena was transformed for the event. Silken banners hung from the highest arches, and musicians filled the lower halls with the soft hum of lyres and flutes. Lucius entered in ceremonial armor, flanked by two others, a former soldier turned trainer and a young Thracian champion whose spirit reminded Lucius of his younger self. The audience watched in reverent silence, then erupted into applause as the performance ended with the three fighters raising their weapons not in challenge, but in salute. That evening, as dusk painted Rome in hues of fire and wine, a messenger arrived at the ludus with a scroll from the emperor. He was escorted through shadowed corridors of marble and mosaic, into a quiet courtyard where the emperor waited beneath a fig tree, robes flowing like river water in the breeze. "You fight like a man who sees the truth," the emperor said without ceremony. Lucius bowed slightly. "I fight as I must." The emperor studied him. Lucius considered the question. The emperor nodded slowly. They parted without further words. Lucius returned to the ludus, Not as a hero, not as a champion. That night, as the city settled beneath the stars, the Colosseum stood still, holding the memory of a performance that whispered of possibilities. And the sands remembered. They always remembered. The days that followed the emperor's invitation were strange in their quietness. The city of Rome returned to its usual rhythm, the streets filled with the scent of spices. Every movement, every breath, every strike of the blade carried not just strength, but awareness. He no longer fought only to win or impress, but to preserve the quiet wisdom buried beneath centuries of blood and smoke. Children running barefoot through alleyways, and merchants shouting prices with weathered voices. But inside the ludus, something had shifted. The men and women there spoke less of glory and more of meaning, less of triumph, more of survival. Lucius awoke each morning before the sun, as he always had, but his routines felt more deliberate now. One evening, as the sky painted itself in the warm colors of dusk, Livia joined him by the edge of the training field. The trees whispered above them, and the scent of laurel filled the air. "There's talk among the guards," she said softly. "About you, about change." Lucius said nothing at first. Then, change never comes, easily. Not escape, not rebellion, but visibility. He wanted Lucius to speak, to appear before the Senate not as a warrior, but as a witness, to share what it meant to live and die in the sand, not as myth, but as man. "They say you could be more than just a fighter," she added, her gaze steady. "That you already are." That night, he walked at the perimeter of the training grounds alone. He thought of the pain, the scars, the loss, and he thought of the silence. The deep, endless silence that followed each match. Once the crowds left and the blood dried, the moon hung low, bright and ancient, its light falling across the rows of sleeping gladiators. The stones beneath his feet were smooth from centuries of wear. To kill not for hatred or justice, but for spectacle. To feel your soul leave slowly with each cheer, each roar of the crowd, until you no longer recognized your own name. Gaius said nothing, only bowed his head in respect. Lucius wore no armor, only a plain tunic and sandals. Would no longer be forced to fight without a chance to earn their freedom through service outside the arena. His presence in the Senate chamber was met with surprise and discomfort. Some turned their heads, others whispered, a few glared openly. He turned to look at her. "Do you believe that?" There, beneath an arched portico and between ancient olive trees, Gaius spoke plainly. Back at the ludus, the others greeted him with quiet nods, not words. They had seen something in his face, a weariness deeper than fatigue, a kind of peace. "I believe we're more than what they want us to be." It was not from the emperor, nor from any official authority. The wax bore the emblem of a senator named Gaius Serranus, a figure known for his controversial ideas and his belief that the games no longer served their original purpose. Lucius offered a small nod, and they stood in silence as the sun slipped behind the rooftops. The next morning, a letter arrived, sealed with a mark that none in the ludus had seen before. Lucius was summoned again, this time not to a palace or a theater, but to a modest villa on the outskirts of the city. "You are not just a gladiator," he said, offering Lucius wine, which he declined. "You are a symbol, whether you want to be or not." Lucius met his gaze. "Symbols are fragile." "Perhaps," Gaius replied, "but they endured." Senator offered him a proposal. Lucius returned to the ludus with the idea sitting heavy in his chest. He thought of every man he had fought beside, those who had died bravely, and those who had been broken quietly. The next morning he agreed. Preparations began quietly. Gaius arranged for a small escort, avoiding attention. He stood beneath the high dome, light filtering through a circular opening above, and spoke. He spoke of what it meant to fight without choice. He did not ask for pity. He asked only for truth. The chamber was still when he finished. Lucius left as quietly as he had arrived. Livia approached him that night. "Did it help?" she asked. "I don't know," he replied, "but I was heard, and in that moment, that was enough." Later that week, a notice was posted in the forum decreeing that certain categories of gladiators, particularly those enslaved through war or falsely imprisoned. It was a small change, a thread in the tapestry, but it was real. And still, the Colosseum stood, ancient and wide-eyed beneath the Roman sun, waiting for the next story to unfold. And the sands remembered. They always remembered. The air over Rome hung heavy with heat, thick with dust and silence as another day began to rise over the Colosseum. Even in the early hours, before the sun reached its full height. The stone walls radiated warmth, absorbing and releasing the echoes of centuries past. In the markets, whispers passed between bakers and carpenters. In the baths, retired soldiers nodded to one another when Lucius's name was mentioned. Even some guards at the Ludus, men once cold and indifferent, now carried themselves with an unexpected stillness in his presence. For Lucius, each morning had become a meditation, a moment to listen not to the clamor of the world, but to the spaces between, where truth resided. Yet beneath it all, there was a new kind of tension, not the fear of death, which had always been present, but the growing awareness that things were not as eternal as they once seemed. She wiped sweat from her brow and leaned back against the trunk. Though the Emperor had not responded directly to Lucius's appearance before the Senate, word of the speech had traveled, quietly, respectfully, yet unmistakably. He was older than most, with scars that told stories longer than many had lived. His name was Cassian, once a general who had fallen out of favor due to political intrigue. Sentenced not to exile, but to the games, a warning to other commanders. He carried himself with dignity, his back straight, his eyes sharp. She and Lucius often trained together now, not as teacher and student, but as equals. Instead, they stood side by side, watching younger gladiators practice. There were moments in their sparring when words were unnecessary. Their blades spoke for them, each strike a sentence, each parry a thought. The Ludus, however, remained unchanged in its function. Fights were still scheduled. Training remained rigorous. The sand still demanded its rituals. Livia continued to rise through the ranks, her technique sharpened, her instincts honed. She moved like fire through shadow, elegant and dangerous. But many others began to lean forward in their seats, watching with real interest. Something different was happening, a performance of power, designed to stir national pride. Cassian fought defensively, guiding the match like a dance. When the boy fell, winded but alive, Cassian threw down his sword. The games would last 7 days, each day more elaborate than the last, but Cassian's knowledge was vast. He spoke of strategy, of battlefield philosophy, of how to read a man's posture before he struck. "I'm not sure that's mine to change." Lucius listened closely. One afternoon, after a particularly intense match, Livia sat beside Lucius under a fig tree growing at the edge of the training yard. Livia was chosen to represent the Eastern Territories. Her opponent was a gladiator from Hispania, a man named Marcellus, known for his silence and strength. She refused to kill it. Instead, using her speed in the terrain, she cornered it, holding her blade to its side, but not striking. The match lasted longer than expected, neither giving in, neither seeking to win through cruelty. He knew the Emperor would be watching. He knew that this match would be the most scrutinized of all. In the end, Livia stepped back, lowered her sword, and bowed. The crowd gasped, then cheered. "Do you think the arena will ever truly change?" she asked. Lucius stared into the distance. Lucius fought a man named Brinos, a towering brute with a reputation for cruelty. But Lucius moved with calm. He disarmed him without drawing blood, pinning him with pressure rather than pain. The crowd was momentarily confused then. Slowly, they applauded, not for violence, but for mastery. "It already has, even if only by a fraction." "That's not enough," she said, not with anger, but quiet resolve. "No," he agreed, "but it's a beginning." That evening, a new arrival was brought to the Ludus. Lucius approached him on his second day. They did not speak at first. "I've seen battles," Cassian said finally. "Real ones, where life and death meant something." Lucius nodded. "And now you're here." Cassian smiled faintly. "It seems honor has many faces." They began to train together, Lucius adjusting his movements to accommodate the older man's slower pace. Weeks passed. The Emperor announced a series of high-profile games, this time not in celebration, but in remembrance, marking 10 years since a major Roman victory in Gaul. Lucius, Livia, and Cassian were all selected to participate. The first day's matches were traditional, pairs of gladiators, matched by size and skill, fighting for show. The second day brought novelty fights, mock, novel battles, animal hunts. Livia faced a wild lion, chained and starved, in an enclosure mimicking a desert village. By the fourth day, murmurs began to rise. "What are these games?" some asked. "Where is the blood?" Cassian fought on the fifth day. He was pitted against a younger man, barely more than a boy, thrown into the arena for a crime he likely did not commit. The Emperor, watching from above, remained unreadable. That night, Gaius visited Lucius again. They met outside the Ludus, under a moonless sky. "You're changing the nature of the games," Gaius said quietly. Lucius looked at him. "No," Gaius said, "but it may be yours to begin." The sixth day arrived. The final match was to be symbolic, one fighter from each of the Emperor's appointed They fought in silence, their blades whispering across the sand. Marcellus did the same. The crowd stood. On the final day, Lucius stood once again before the gates. But he also knew that the sands beneath his feet remembered, and this time they would remember something new. The morning after the final match of the commemorative games, Rome awoke to something unfamiliar. It wasn't silence, nor was it uproar. It was reflection. For the first time in living memory, the Colosseum's legacy was being reconsidered, not through legend or fear, but through quiet conversation. They talked not of bloodshed or victory, but of restraint, of honor, of a different kind of courage. And always, Lucius's name was on their lips, as was Livius Cassian's, and even Marcellus's. People spoke in the markets, at temples, in the shaded gardens where nobles gathered. Lucius himself had returned to the Ludus in silence. It was a shared understanding that they were part of something larger than any one match, a quiet revolution, measured in the beat of their hearts and the rhythm of their steps. After the match, he had simply walked off the arena floor, nodding once to the Emperor's box, and then disappearing behind the curtain of stone arches. There was no grand gesture, no speech. He didn't need one. The arena had spoken for him. Philosophers discussed it with admiration. Poets, always quick to sense change, began composing verses that celebrated the grace of the games rather than the gore. Even some senators, though, quietly began to wonder aloud in private gatherings if Rome's strength might also be shown in its restraint. In the Ludus, the other gladiators looked at him with something beyond respect. Now it was not worship, not fear. Cassian, ever observant, pulled Lucius aside that afternoon. They met in a dim chamber where only the flicker of oil lamps lit the marble floor. "You've done more than challenge the crowd," he said. "You've unsettled the Emperor." "If I may, Majesty, what they are doing is still entertaining. The people remain engaged." Lucius raised an eyebrow. "Unsettled how?" Cassian smiled faintly. "When rulers see the crowd cheer for mercy over violence, they begin to question their grip. Let them think, for now. Let us watch what they do next." She was admired not only for her technique, but for the emotion she carried into the arena. She made the crowd feel, and that, in Rome, was a kind of power that rivaled any senator. Lucius nodded. "Then we must continue, carefully, and sometimes a single degree is all that's needed for a new world to unfold. Not just those skilled with the sword, but those with spirit." He called it the circle. Quietly, without fanfare, they trained together, not for killing, but for storytelling through combat. A teacher asking if we would demonstrate the art of gladiator combat. They're asking to understand. The children, wide-eyed and curious, watched as Lucius and Livia demonstrated the steps, the forms, the principles of balance and discipline. Cassian explained the history, not as a glorification of war, but as a reflection of Rome's complex heart, not to be entertained. The arena, once a stage for death, now hinted at becoming a stage for something else. That is the beginning. Not the violence, the movement, the meaning. One, named Drusus, challenged Lucius in public, calling him a traitor to the old ways. Hundreds gathered, not for blood, but to see what path Lucius would take. They studied ancient forms of movement, inspired by myths and histories. He refused to strike for injury. He deflected, turned, guided. The match lasted long minutes, and in the end, Lucius disarmed Drusus and offered him his sword back. Their matches began to resemble dances, stories without words, battles where the ending didn't always require a fallen foe. Elsewhere in the city, word of Lucius's actions had reached the homes of the educated elite. Yet within the palace, not all were pleased. The emperor summoned his advisors. Among them was Gaius, who now walked a delicate line between loyalty to Rome as traditions and support for Lucius's vision. "These gladiators are gaining too much influence," one advisor warned. "Just those within the circle, standing in a ring around a single flame." The emperor asked, his tone unreadable. "They're redefining what the games mean," another said. "If the crowd stops hungering for blood," Gaius cleared his throat. "But they're also thinking," the first advisor said sharply. The emperor raised a hand. silencing them. Dignity, purpose. We are not only fighters, we are mirrors, and what we reflect can shape the world. Back at the Ludus, Lucius began assembling a group of fighters who shared his vision. Livia became a key part of the circle. Her matches began drawing more and more spectators. One afternoon, as the sun dipped low and the walls of the Colosseum turned gold, Lucius sat with Cassian on a low stone bench outside the training yard. "Do you believe this will last?" Lucius asked. Cassian looked at the horizon. "I believe we've shifted the course, even if only by a degree." As they sat, Livia approached with a parchment in hand. "It's from a school in the Subura district," she said. Lucius took the parchment, his eyes soft. "The children," he said quietly. And so they went. The circle visited the school on a clear morning. When one of the smallest children asked, "Do you always win?" Lucius knelt and answered softly, "No, but sometimes the truest victory is when both walk away stronger." Word of this visit spread quickly. Other schools sent invitations. Nobles began asking for private demonstrations, not of blood sport, but of artistry. Yet the threat remained. Change is never without resistance. Some of the older gladiators, those who thrived on brutality, began to speak out. They saw the new way as weakness. Lucius accepted the challenge. The fight was held in the smaller amphitheater where training bouts were occasionally showcased. The fight was fierce. Drusus was powerful, his strikes hard and fast, but Lucius was calm, fluid, moving like water around fire. Drusus hesitated. Then, slowly, he took it and knelt. The crowd cheered not for the violence, but for the restraint, the grace. Gaius, watching from the shadows, allowed himself a small smile. That night, a quiet ceremony was held within the Ludices. No torches, no banners. Lucius spoke softly. "This is not the end of the old ways. It is the remembering of something older." The flame flickered, steady and small. Outside, Rome continued to move, unaware that its soul had shifted by one quiet breath. The first light of morning arrived like a soft whisper, brushing the pale stones of the Ludus with gentle warmth. A damp chill lingered in the air from the night's dew, but already the courtyards hushed beneath the steady rhythm of practice. The soft thud of wooden swords on shields, the scrape of sandals against packed earth, and the quiet breath of those who moved with purpose rather than haste. It would be a silent contest of wills, who could stand unmoving at dawn until dusk, grounded in both body and mind. A contest without weapons, meant to forge unity in stillness rather than spectacle in violence. Hours passed. The clang of hammer on iron drifted from the smithy. The call of a distant hawk echoed above the walls, but within each contestant, the only sound was the beating of their own heart. Lucius walked among his comrades, pausing to offer a nod or a brief, understanding glance. He glanced at each member in turn, noting the exhaustion etched on every face, the quiet pride in every posture. Then, as the final rays of light touched the courtyard stones, he rose and took a single, slow step forward. Flames danced and flickered, casting shifting patterns of light and shadow. Lucius spoke. Livia practiced footwork beneath the olive trees, her blade tracing arcs through the air with effortless precision. No cheers, no roar. It can be a place of beginnings for understanding, for unity, for purpose. Just the movement of souls aligned. Cassian oversaw a small group of recruits, his deep voice guiding their stances, reminding them that true power lay not in force alone, but in intention. The Emperor's next season of marches was announced a series of tests of prowess, long-distance duels at dawn, staged hunts at dusk, and the grand finale, a tempest match pitting for fighters against a simulated storm of mechanical traps and moving platforms. No words were spoken. The challenge was simple and formidable. They navigated swinging weights, rotating pillars, and sudden pitfalls with grace, supporting one another when footing failed, lifting each other from the depths of the sand. When the match ended, the four stood arms linked, breathing hard but unbowed. The Emperor rose from his box and applauded a silent acknowledgement of something new. Their performance was not about defeating one another, but about mastering chaos as a single unit. Every time we step into the sand, it will not just be to fight, but to teach. We proved that endurance is as noble as victory, that stillness can be as transformative as motion. They were forged, not in fire, but in stillness, in a simplicity of holding one's ground, each found a deeper core of strength. Today was the day the circle had chosen for a new gathering, a demonstration of endurance held not for the crowd, but for themselves. As the sun climbed, each member found their chosen spot in the yard, a patch of scrub grass, a worn stone slab, the curve of a bat. Lucius settled against the rough bark of a mulberry tree, breathing slowly, sensing the warmth at the base of his spine and the cool air on his face. Philosophers wrote of it in their scrolls. Artisans carved its story on small reliefs. Even the atrium of the Senate buzzed with whispers of gladiators, who fought without blades and won without blood. By midday, shadows shifted and lengthened. Livia's shoulders relaxed, then straightened again. The sand was raked into ridges and furrows to mimic the tumult of a storm-racked sea. Mechanisms hissed and clicked beneath the surface, ready to shift at a moment's notice. Cassian remained motionless, his eyes open but unfocused, tracing the flight of a solitary swallow. Others began to falter, legs trembling, brows slick with sweat, but the circle pressed on, consuming their fatigue like fuel. In that shared struggle, something remarkable took shape, a bond that transcended the blade. As the sun dipped low toward the western horizon, Lucius opened his eyes fully. One by one, the others followed. That evening, the circle gathered around a brazier at the center of the yard. We fought not with swords today, but with the will to remain. Livia leaned forward. What does this mean for the arena? Lucius considered. It means that the arena can be more than a place of endings. Cassian added, we will carry this into our... A hush fell over the group, heavy with resolve. The next morning, word spread through the ludus that the circle's challenge had become the talk of Rome. Yet still, the games continued. Lucius, Livia, Cassian, and a select few from the circle were chosen to participate. It was an unusual honor and a formidable challenge. On the day of the Tempest match, the Colosseum was decorated with banners depicting lightning bolts and swirling clouds. When the horn blew, the 4 gladiators advanced together, moving in coordinated harmony. The crowd watched, rapt. The usual cries for blood were replaced by gasps of wonder and shouts of encouragement. Back in the ludus, as the dust settled and the machines rested, the circle gathered once more. Gratitude and solemn pride shone in every eye. Lucius spoke softly. We have shown them that even chaos yields to cooperation. That strength is found not only in solitude, but in solidarity. Livia smiled. What comes next? Lucius gazed at the darkening sky. We continue. And as night settled over Rome, the Colosseum's sands lay still, bearing the imprint of steady feet and unwavering hearts. The days following the Tempest match passed with a strange serenity. The ludus, once defined by its daily rituals of blade and blood, now moved with a gentler rhythm. Even the trainers, hardened men shaped by decades of discipline and violence, had softened at their edge, ever so slightly. They could not ignore what they had witnessed. The crowd's reaction had been more than admiration. It had been a shift in perception. Her philosophy was simple. Not every strike needed to land. Not every battle needed to be fought. In stillness, clarity arose. Her students sat with her for hours, unmoving, observing the light as it passed across the walls, learning to breathe without thought, to respond without haste. The circle returned to their routines, but with a renewed sense of quiet purpose. The purpose was clear to test whether unity could withstand solitary destruction. Training no longer felt like preparation for survival alone, but a form of shared meditation. Just the faint creak of torch brackets and the rustling of the wind through olive branches. He feared what Varro represented, a return to spectacle over spirit, to dominance over harmony. When Lucius rose in the morning, he no longer viewed the day ahead as a test. It was a continuation of something deeper, something that had started long before the crowd had begun to applaud their unity. He would not play the old game. He would bring a different rhythm to the sand. Word had spread that today would determine something larger than victory. Cassian began teaching a new drill, one that used rhythm and timing instead of aggression. His eyes were sharp but distant, like an animal long removed from its forest. He wore no helmet, only a light tunic, an armed guard. In his hand, a simple wooden sword, smoothed and he called it the echo step, a series of movements based on listening to the breath and pace of others. In the yard, the circle moved like flowing water, each step rippling out from the last, each motion connected not by instruction but instinct. Livia, meanwhile, taught the art of waiting. It was during this time that word reached the ludus of a new contender. a gladiator from the distant province, known only as his marchers were already legendary for their brutality. He was said to fight not with rage, but with something colder, something devoid of empathy. He simply lowered his sword and stood open, exposed. When he lunged, Lucius sidestepped, graceful and precise. Another strike came, and again Lucius flowed around it, never striking back. His strikes grew erratic, not from exhaustion, but confusion. He had never fought a man who refused to fight. No partner, no mercy, no cause beyond the arena. Rumors swirled like wind through the marble halls. Varro had defeated 6 men in a single match. He had broken a champion's shield with one blow. He had never once spoken after combat, never acknowledged the crowd. The Senate watched him with interest, and the Emperor saw in him a spectacle of raw, untamed dominance. Eventually, it was announced that Varro would face the Circle's finest in a series of one-on-one duels. These would not be... There would be no alliances. If even Varro can step away from violence, then perhaps so can others. Lucius was chosen to face him first. He joined their meditations. Slowly, without fanfare, he changed. The Emperor saw the value in it not just as spectacle, but as control. A peaceful Rome was a prosperous Rome, and when the final lunge came, desperate and wild, Lucius ducked and placed his palm gently against Varro's chest. The evening before the match, the ludus was silent. No practice, no chatter. Lucius sat alone in the courtyard, eyes closed. He did not fear Varro's strength. Livia joined him, sitting in silence. Eventually, she placed her hand on his. "You will not fight him," she whispered. "You will show him." Lucius nodded. At dawn, the Colosseum filled slowly. The mood hushed. Reverent, this was not an ordinary match. The gates opened, and Lucius stepped into the arena. Varro followed. He was taller, broader, wrapped in iron and leather. They met at the center. The horn sounded. Lucius did not move. Varro approached slowly, circling, testing for weakness. The crowd murmured. Was this fear? Was this surrender? But then, something strange happened. Varro's rhythm faltered. Lucius moved like water, like breath. He let Varro tire himself in the sand, let the weight of the armor drag him down. It was not a blow. It was a gesture. The crowd was silent. Varro froze. Lucius stepped back, lowered his hand, and bowed. Varro stood, breathing hard. He looked at Lucius, and for the first time, his mask of indifference cracked. Not with anger, not with rage, but with the faintest flicker of something like recognition. He dropped his weapon. The crowd erupted not with cheers of triumph, but with something more powerful. Respect. That night, the circle sat under the stars. Lucius spoke quietly. "I did not win. I did not lose. I offered him a mirror. What he saw was his choice." Cassian nodded, and what we saw was hope. Livia leaned back. In the days that followed, Varro remained at the ludus. He spoke little, but trained beside the circle. He watched their drills, and the games began to change with him. A new season was planned. Less blood, more skill, more unity. But deeper than politics or power, something quieter was stirring. A return to dignity, to brotherhood, to peace in the shadow of war. And as Lucius walked the quiet halls of the ludus, he knew the battle was not over, but it was no longer the same fight. It had become something larger, something worth carrying beyond the sands. The wind over the city of Rome carried with it a stillness that had not been felt in a long time. It was not silence, for the markets still bustled, the temples still echoed with prayer, and the soldiers still marched. Each morning he trained not with ferocity, but with patience, joining Lucius, Livia, and the others in routines that resembled dance more than combat. He listened more than he spoke, and when he did speak, his words were simple and few. But beneath the surface of these sounds was a soft calmness, like the steady breathing of a man finally at peace with himself. Inside the ludus, this stillness took shape as a new way of moving, of thinking. He called for a spectacle that would shatter the illusion of peace. His words were met with silence. Livia warned that the crowd would not accept such cruelty again, but Marcellus laughed. He believed the people wanted violence. The condemned were brought out, trembling and chained, eyes wide with fear. They carried no weapons. The crowd was restless, confused. This was not the spectacle they expected. He believed they needed to be reminded who held power. Behind him came Cassian, then Livia, then Varro. One by one, The circle walked into the arena and stood between the prisoners and the execution. He commissioned a match designed not to entertain, but to humiliate. He gathered condemned prisoners from the provinces, weak and unarmed, and announced a display of Roman power. They did not look to the crowd, they looked only at the helpless figures before them. Against them would stand not one, but several elite gladiators, chosen not for their wisdom or control, but for their bloodlust. They had come for blood, but found themselves entranced by the flow of movement, the quiet tension of restraint, the rhythm of controlled power. The circle returned to the ludus in silence, but they carried with them the weight of change. We will not fight the helpless. We will not play the role of monsters. Not the fear, not the violence, but the courage to stand in its way. Word reached the Senate that the Colosseum's tone had softened. Some among the elite were not pleased. They saw the games not just as entertainment, but as a means of control, a way to show strength, to reinforce the order of empire. To them, this shift toward balance and unity was dangerous. Then someone stood. Then another. Slowly, people began to chant not for blood, but for mercy. They feared what it might stir in the hearts of the people. The crowd began to admire skill more than savagery, harmony more than havoc. Matches were to include balance. Strength and skill were to be tested with honor. They grew older. Some retired. Others became teachers. But the rhythm they had created endured. Gladiators were no longer viewed as expendable tools, but as artists of discipline and motion. They mimicked the movements of the echo step, whispered the names of Lucius and Livia like prayers. The applause changed. It became slower, deeper, more thoughtful. The cheers were no longer for dominance, but for discipline. Varro, once the storm that tore through bodies and shook the arena, now moved with the deliberate grace of a learner. The circle had grown. Other gladiators who once stood apart began to watch the way they trained, the way they worked together. The people had seen a different kind of heroism, and they would not unsee it. And over time, they stepped closer, joining quietly without asking. What began as a small band of warriors seeking dignity in the face of violence had become something larger, something harder to ignore. Even the trainers, who once barked orders with iron tongues, had changed their tone. They now guided rather than commanded, watched rather than judged. The arena's audiences noticed the change, but as with all things that grow, shadows followed. A senator named Marcellus, known for his pride and cruelty, saw the circle's influence as a threat. The circle protested. Lucius himself petitioned the organizers to cancel the match, to restore dignity to the arena. The day of the match arrived. The sun rose red over the marble walls of the Colosseum, casting long shadows that stretched across the sand. From the other gate, the chosen gladiators entered, brutal men with cold eyes and polished armor. And then, unexpectedly, from the side entrance, Lucius stepped into the arena. Gasps rippled through the audience. He was not scheduled to fight. The two groups faced each other in silence. Lucius spoke, not to the men before him, but to the crowd. "This is not what Rome stands for," he said. "This is not power. This is fear disguised as strength." The crowd murmured. Marcellus watched from his balcony, his face a mask of rage. But even he could not silence the tide that had risen. The match was halted. The prisoners were spared. That night, the city hummed with quiet conversation. In taverns and temples, in villas and alleys, people spoke of what they had seen. The next morning, the emperor himself summoned Lucius. The chamber was grand and cold, its marble walls gleaming like ice. Lucius bowed deeply, waiting for judgment. But the emperor did not speak of punishment. Instead, he asked a question. "Do you believe peace can live in the arena?" Lucius lifted his head. "I believe it already does, if we let it." The emperor was silent for a long moment. Then he nodded once and dismissed him. As Lucius left, he felt the weight of Rome pressing against his shoulders. But it was not a burden. It was a responsibility. In the days that followed, new rules were quietly introduced. The circle continued their training, and in the quiet corners of the city, children began to play not as conquerors, but as protectors. It was not the end of the Colosseum, nor the end of conflict, but it was a beginning. And sometimes beginnings are enough to change the shape of history. The Roman morning unfolded slowly, stretching its golden limbs over rooftops of stone and marble, brushing gently against the tiled domes and shaded courtyards of the eternal city. In the Ludus Magnus, the grand training ground for gladiators. Life had settled into a kind of quiet rhythm, less defined by the clang of weapons and more by the steady murmur of breath and movement. A small notebook rested in his hand, its pages filled with short observations, words he had begun recording to understand the deeper things: balance, fear, mercy, and strength, not shown through force, but through restraint. He didn't speak at first. He merely watched the wind move the leaves in slow spirals across the courtyard. Once a warrior of instinct, he had become a student of nuance. Time no longer moved in great dramatic flourishes of violence, but in calm, deliberate pulses of preparation and reflection. Not everyone embraced it, and not all hearts were softened, but the air itself seemed a little lighter. The marches in the Colosseum still occurred, but more often they were competitions of agility, cleverness, and control. Her movements were no less powerful, but more elegant, more in tune with the earth beneath her. When she trained with the others, it felt like watching waves glide across a still sea. Even the most hardened trainers observed in silence, humbled by her mastery of presence. The crowds cheered not for death, but for defiance, not of authority, but of brutality. They were invited to perform demonstrations, not for the spectacle of violence, but for the display of strength as a form of inner peace. No one led, and no one followed. Each warrior sensed the next without words, their feet and hands guided by trust, by the silent rhythm they had cultivated through seasons of pain and patience. First the Empress, her hands folded in respect, then the Emperor, then the court, a full, standing recognition, not for dominance. A school of movement founded by the circle, not just for warriors, but for anyone who sought balance. Citizens, merchants, even politicians came to learn the dance of harmony. It spread like a quiet flame through the city's heart, warming the cold edges of power and fear, but for understanding. But it was not the silence of confusion. It was the silence of awe. It became known as the harmonies of the arena, a kind of living art that brought stillness to the heart, even as the body moved with force and precision. The Emperor's court began to attend, nobles leaning forward not to count wounds, but to understand motion. They saw their peaceful philosophy as a challenge to tradition, a dangerous softness that could undermine authority. Lucius sat beneath a sycamore tree in the rear courtyard, where the sun filtered through the wide branches in soft layers of warmth and shadow. Pharaoh joined him, his massive frame settling beside the older man with a softness that belied his appearance. The Colosseum, filled with senators, scholars, and foreign dignitaries, was calm. He would arrange a contest, one that could not be tamed by grace or principle. The mercenaries lunged, but found no targets. Their violence struck only air. The circle did not retaliate. They guided, they redirected, they neutralized, confused. Their rage, unreciprocated, drained them, and finally, they stopped. A match so brutal, so chaotic, that even the circle would falter. They did not ready themselves with new weapons or harder armor. The Colosseum lit by torches that flickered against the shadows of doubt and resistance. The crowd was smaller, but every eye was sharp with expectation. They prepared through reflection, through unity, through remembering who they had become. He recruited mercenaries, men with no honor and no care for legacy, only blood. They simply nodded, as if something sacred had been confirmed. In that silence, the circle entered, dressed not in armor, but in flowing garments of white and deep blue, symbols of earth and sky. Their weapons were polished but unused. They shouted, they snarled, they threw weapons in the air. There were chaos embodied. It bore the imperial seal, but the script was delicate, unmistakably written by the Empress herself. The circle accepted. "We never imagined it could feel like this," Pharaoh said finally. Lucius smiled gently, not looking away from his notes. They weaved through one another, stepping, turning, bowing, extending, telling a story not of triumph, but of transformation. They showed fear and release, strength and surrender, a mirrored dance of humanity at war with itself, and at peace with its potential. He spoke more about mind than muscle, about knowing when not to strike, about breathing before acting. His students watched him closely, sensing that they were learning not just to survive, but to understand the sacredness of life, even in the arena. No, but we hoped. In the months following the moment in the arena when they stood between cruelty and conscience, the city had begun to feel a subtle change. Cassian had begun teaching the youngest recruits. His methods were different, Now Livia too had shifted. Where once she had danced like fire in battle, she now taught grace and intention. The circle had become more than a group of gladiators. It had become a symbol, a quiet resistance to the chaos of old ways. There was something meditative about the way the circle moved together. One evening, under a dusk sky painted in violet and gold, Lucius received a letter. She invited them to perform not in battle, but in presence, to show the nobility that peace was not weakness, and that beauty could emerge from conflict transformed. The day of the presentation arrived quietly. There were no roars from the stands, no drums, no fanfare. What followed was not a fight, but a ritual, a movement piece, a conversation made through motion. When they finished, there was no immediate applause. Then, one by one, people stood. That night, the circle returned to their ludus, not as performers, but as catalysts. In the weeks that followed, something new emerged in Rome. But not all welcomed the change. In the shadows of the Senate, whispers gathered. Some feared the influence of the circle. One such man, Senator Gallas, devised a plan. Word of the challenge reached Lucius in a sealed scroll. He read it, then handed it to Cassian. "We are being called again," Lucius said. Cassian frowned. "This time, they want to break us. Then we show them what cannot be broken," Lucius replied. They prepared in silence. No one spoke of fear, only of truth. The match was scheduled under the cover of night. The mercenaries entered with fury. Then the circle entered. No noise, no threats, only calm. The match began. But what unfolded was not a battle. It was a demonstration of breath, of movement, of patience. The audience grew still. They had come for a storm, but witnessed the sea itself, resisting the wind. One by one, the mercenaries tired. Lucius stepped forward, not with a weapon, but with an open hand. "This is not weakness," he said. "This is control." Senator Gallus, watching from the shadows, turned away. The people did not cheer. Back in the ludus under a moonlit sky, the circle sat together. No victory had been declared. None was needed. "We didn't fight," Varro said softly. "No," Lucius answered. "We stood." Livia looked up at the stars, their quiet sparkle uninterrupted, and sometimes she whispered, "That is everything." Morning in Rome carried a sound unlike any other city. It was not silence, nor noise, but something suspended between the two. It began with soft footsteps on stone alleys, the cooing of doves high in their perches. They moved through morning rituals, not out of need for readiness, but because the quiet hours brought clarity. Lucius stood alone in the garden courtyard, watching as light filtered through the olive branches. His hands, once used for swordplay, now held seeds, pressing them into soil with the same care he once offered to the edge of a blade. "We plant so something may remain, even when we're gone." He had come to believe in the act of growing, not just food, but memory, kindness, peace. The distant roar of metal gates lifting slowly with the start of trade, and the gentle splash of water from fountains whispering through the plazas. In this delicate hum, life moved slowly, thoughtfully, like the breath of an old soul awakening again. They sat in the training hall, no longer the arena of shouts and strikes, but a place where voices flowed like water. In the ludus, the circle rose early, not from duty, but from rhythm. Cassian arrived behind him, holding a cup of herbal tea. His shoulder still bore a fading scar from years past, but even that mark had softened over time, like the rest of him. They remember what Rome used to send in times like these. They want to try something else, someone else, not to fight, but to show that strength can live without cruelty. "Still planting?" Cassian asked with a smile. Walls once built to keep enemies out now felt like cages. "But if your fame draws challenge, I will not hold the tide." Markets were half full. Guards stood with nervous eyes. No one trusted the next sunrise. They traveled on foot, through shaded forests and along riverbanks, stopping at villages where children ran to meet them and elders blessed their steps. They trained in public spaces, not to impress, but to invite. Children copied their movements. Vendors paused to watch their breathwork. In the hills beyond the city, a band of mercenaries gathered. They had profited from tension, sold fear like wine, fed on the divisions that now weakened. Their leader, a man known only as Hadron, had once fought in the Colosseum, but never left the thirst behind. Elders murmured that they had never seen warriors move with such stillness. The mercenaries waited in a half-circle of stone, armed and ready, mocking the very idea of peace. Hadron stepped forward, scarred and heavy with defiance. News of the circle had spread quietly, carried not by messengers, but by memory. People spoke not of their battles, but of their balance. They stepped, turned, drew invisible lines in the dust. The mercenaries lunged, but found their strikes absorbed, redirected, diffused. It was not combat, it was redirection. Energy moved like water, and no sword can cut the sea. Lucius nodded, then let it be something good. And finally, they stopped. A chance to apply everything they had lived, learned, and earned, not just for themselves, but for the world watching. The others joined them gradually. Livia, barefoot, her hair wet from a morning rinse in the stream behind the barracks. We do not seek to control the tide, only to move with it. Varro, already stretching in the courtyard with his eyes closed, moving with the fluidity of a dancer. Mercenaries in circles sat together, learning each other's names. Slowly, yes, but deeply. Its people built new circles of their own, movement classes, breath rituals, night vigils of silence and strength. The circle did not stay. They were never meant to, but they left behind something that lived longer than legacy. Telling truths, others followed, each bringing their own presence into the shared peace of the morning. He bore a scroll with a red wax seal, this time marked not by imperial authority, but by the emblem of a nearby province, a town on the border, quiet, unremarkable in maps, but now caught in unrest. The world outside still stirred with its own pace. Emperors shifted, senators schemed, distant borders were pressed by hungry ambitions. But within these walls, a different Rome existed. Women who once stood in doorways in fear now joined the circles of motion, learning how to ground their bodies in the earth, how to move with clarity and calm, not ruled by command, but by calm, not built on stone alone, but on trust. That afternoon, a messenger arrived on horseback, dust trailing behind him as he dismounted. Lucius gathered the circle. The governor there, Lucius began, has asked for help, not with war, not with weapons, with healing. Livia looked up. What kind of healing? The people are divided, he said. There's been no violence yet, but fear is rising. Cassian leaned forward. They want the circle. Lucius nodded. There was no hesitation, not because they sought glory, but because they recognized the weight of this moment. The journey to Illyricum took days. When they arrived in Illyricum, they found a city unsure of itself. The governor welcomed them cautiously. If your presence brings peace, he said, then you are welcome. Lucius bowed. The circle began quietly. They did not lecture. They listened. They sat in crowded halls and open courtyards. Soon, others joined them. Young men who had once held sticks as weapons now held them in balance. Conflict, once the city's heartbeat, began to lose its rhythm. But not everyone approved. He sent a message to the city. Send your circle to the hills. Prove your peace where blades still speak. The governor turned to Lucius. You are not obligated. Lucius smiled faintly. Nor are we afraid. They climbed the hills at dawn, the sun rising behind them. You come to talk. Lucius shook his head. We come to show. And with that, the circle moved. Not with aggression, but with awareness. One by one, the mercenaries faltered. Not from injury, but from confusion. Their momentum failed. Their rhythm broke. Hadron stood alone, breathing heavily. You shame me, he muttered. Lucius stepped forward. No. We remind you. And he offered his hand. Hadron looked at it for a long time, then took it. That night, the fire in the hills burned not with rage, but with shared stories. Illyricum changed. When the circle returned to Rome, they found the city waiting, not for battle, but for what came next, because once the tide turns, it does not return unchanged.